Hey guys, it's Matt from Mr. Matt's Arcade here. Today we're going to be working on disassembling my 1515 Workbee CNC in order to get it ready for the Queenbee Ultra upgrade. I purchased this machine approximately a year ago from Yuyong Industries, and the machine's been great. I've had zero issues with it. It's still all the original parts. I haven't had to replace anything. But they came out with an upgrade kit that upgrades the V-wheels to linear rails. And that's supposed to make the machine more rigid, more accurate, and just overall a better machine. So I purchased the upgrade kit. I did an unboxing video already. If you haven't seen that, go ahead and go check it out. And this is the next step in the series, and this one is going to be disassembling the Workbee in order to get it ready for the upgrade kit. Alright, so first thing we're going to work on is removing the X-axis. Alright guys, so the first thing we're going to work on is we're going to remove the X and the Z-axis stepper motor. So tools that you will need in general for the whole disassembly, you will need an 8mm wrench and a couple of different types of Allen keys or Allen heads. And that should be it. So to start, I went ahead and labeled my wires for the X motor, labeled both sides so that way I can disconnect them and it'll be easier to trace the wires later. Did the same thing for the Z. Go ahead and disconnect those. And the Z limit switch. Go ahead and disconnect that. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the bolts for the X motor. So you remove these four M5 55mm bolts. And they should unscrew pretty easily. I'm going to loosen all four of them up. When you remove the bolt, there's going to be two spacers, a 40mm spacer and a 6mm spacer. And you're going to want to label and save all your nuts and bolts because a lot of these are going to be reused when we do the upgrade assembly. Before you remove the last bolt for the motor, you're going to want to loosen the flexible coupler so that way the motor will slide off of the shaft. You may actually want to do that first before you start removing any bolts. Again, make sure you label your bolts and spacers. There we go, there's one motor. So now we're going to repeat the same thing for the Z-axis motor. And that one has four M5 55mm screws and only a 40mm spacer. So I'll go ahead and undo those. We will loosen them all up. And let's loosen that shaft coupler. Looks like you're going to have to hold your Z-axis up while you do this. Now there's nothing holding it in place because the motor's not hooked up to it. I would actually recommend removing your spindle prior to removing the Z-axis motor. That way there's less weight on this piece right here. So now let's remove the flexible coupler. Loosen up the other one. And you can pull that right off. Then let's remove the lock collar. So we'll remove the lock collar, 8mm lock collar. And then we'll remove the thrust bearing, which has 3 pieces. One silver, one with bearings, and another silver. And make sure to label those and put them aside for later. All right, now we can start loosening up the bolts that hold the X-beam in place. Remove these bolts from the Y plate. They are M5 15mm low profile. And before we go any further, we're going to go around to the other side and get this lead screw out of the way. All right, now we're at the other side of the Y plate. We're going to remove these bolts, just like we did on the other side. Now we're going to remove this lock collar. And the 3-piece thrust bearing. Then on the inside of this, there's another lock collar. So we're going to loosen that up. And then we're going to see if we can unscrew the lead screw coming out this way. First, we will loosen up that other lock collar. Move it around, make sure it's nice and loose. There are a couple of bearings and shims in there too. Now let's go ahead and try to unscrew it. Yep, it's coming right out. I'm going to go down to the other end. There is another lock collar and some bearings and shims on that side. So I'm going to take those off so then we can finish unscrewing the lead screw. Sorry, it's probably pretty hard to see, but right on the inside here, there's a bearing and a shim and then another lock collar. So we're going to loosen up that lock collar. Then we're going to screw the lead screw out far enough that we can get in there. to remove those items. I'm just going to unscrew it all the way and catch them. Alright, they are right in there, and I will retrieve them afterwards. We'll move back to the other side. Alright, here is the lock collar, shim, and bearing that was on the other end. I loosened up the lock collar, started unscrewing the lead screw until I had enough room to take these off of the end. So now we're going to continue unscrewing the lead screw. And right on the inside here is also another shim, bearing, and lock collar. So we'll have to catch those when it gets to the end. There we go. Make sure you don't bend your lead screw. And then there is the bearing, lock collar, and shim. And make sure you don't lose your little set screw for the lock collar. Mine fell off, but I see it, so I'm going to go ahead and grab it. So the next step is to finish removing these black angle connectors. I think that's the last thing that's holding on this side of the X beam to the Y plate. You will probably only have a couple of these. I had an extra one that I put on top here, but here's what the angle connector is. And on the other side of this is two black angle connectors. So to undo those, you gotta hold one end with your 8mm screw and undo the other side with your Allen wrench. That looks like everything that's holding this end on. So I'm going to go around to the other side and repeat the process. Alright, I removed everything from the other side of this X-beam, and it's just slightly loosed, but it's wedged in here pretty tight, so we're going to leave it as is for the moment. And then there's this other smaller beam here, held in by two of the M5 low profile 15mm bolts. So we're going to go ahead and undo those. Alright, I'm going to go around to the other side and undo the other two on that side. Before we remove these beams, there's a couple other things we have to do. You have to disconnect your spindle if you haven't already disconnected it and or removed the spindle. So this just unscrews. And put that out of the way. And then the other thing that we need to remove is the bolt holding the drag chain to the X carriage. And it looks like I have just one bolt holding it on. So go ahead and remove that. Alright, got the bolt off. Pop that nut out. Now you should be able to take your drag chain and move it off to the side. And we also need to remove one more bolt holding your drag chain to this beam, and then that beam will be free. But now that all that's out of the way, we should be able to lift up and slide the X beam out of the way. and slide your X carriage and Z axis off of it. There we go. There is your X beam. Both of your X beams and your Z axis and X carriage assembly are all disconnected from the Y plates. Alright guys, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these wires from the drag chain. So I'm going to go ahead and just pop all these little pieces, throw a couple at the screen while I'm doing it. So I'm going to go ahead and pop those all off so that way I can remove the wires from the drag chain. Because then we're going to remove the wires out through the opening here in the Y plate. So I'll go ahead and get that done, and then we'll move on to the next step. Alright guys, turns out that the end of my spindle wire will not fit through this hole. So I'm going to have to go ahead and disconnect the spindle wire at the other end from my VFD and pull it all through this drag chain. I was trying to prevent that to make it easier when we assemble the new upgrade kit. But I believe I can still leave the rest of the wires in place in this drag chain. It looks like right now I just need to remove the spindle wire. So I'm going to go ahead and get that done, and then we'll move on to the next step. Alright, next up is we're going to disassemble the Z axis. We're going to remove the spindle, and we're going to remove the X carriage. As I said before, probably would have been better to remove the spindle in the beginning to remove some weight from this. But we're going to go ahead and remove it right now. I'm going to loosen up these black angle connectors that are holding my spindle mounts on. So I'm going to go ahead and finish removing these black angle connectors. That way I can take the spindle and the two mounts directly off of it. Alright, we have the spindle and mounts removed. Now I'm going to remove part of my makeshift modified Z-axis limit switch setup. So get that out of the way. Now we're going to work on removing the bottom plate. The bottom plate has 4 M5 15 millimeter low profile screws. So go ahead and undo those. There you go. Once you remove those 4 screws, you can pop off the bottom plate. And you can take off the Z88, the 688Z bearing. And loosen up the lock collar and remove that as well. Looks like that one's stuck right now, so I'll have to get back to that one. But we'll switch around to the other side and see if I can undo this one. There we go. We're able to loosen that one up. So then we will unscrew the Z-axis Acme nut, or Acme screw, and then we will remove the bearing and the 8 millimeter lock collar. And then there you go. You can remove the entire Z-axis Acme screw, lead screw. And I'll just have to get that one off a little bit later. All right, now we should be able to slide the X carriage off completely. We can put that aside. Then we can flip around and undo these other 4 M5 15mm screws. Go, and there's your top plate, and here's your Z-axis C-beam. I'm not sure yet if we are going to need to disassemble the X carriage. Not sure if we need to reuse any of these parts, so I'm going to put it aside for now, and we'll come back to it later if need be. Alright guys, next thing we're going to work on is removing the end plates on both ends on each side. So we'll start here. And there is 4, I believe. 4 M5 15mm low profile screws that attach the plate to this beam. So we're going to go ahead and undo those. Then there's also 4 M5 12mm screws that attach it to this other beam here. All right, that was the last one holding the beam on. And now we are going to loosen and remove the lock collar. Then the 3-piece thrust bearing. Then we'll loosen the lock. Oh, we can pop that plate right off. We can pop off this bearing, the 8mm bearing and 8mm shim. And we can take off this lock collar as well. Now we're going to go down to the other end. We are going to loosen the lock collar that's on the inside at this end. All right, that's loose. We are going to loosen the motor coupler for the motor at this end. Then on the other side of this, just like the other axes, there is a lock collar again. So we're going to loosen that guy up. Now we should be able to start unscrewing the lead screw. You want to do it slowly so you can pull off the lock collar and thrust bearing. And then you can pull off the bearing, shim, and lock collar on this side. And then we can go ahead and unscrew the lead screw. we go. That lead screw is all set. So now we'll move down to the other end and we'll remove the stepper motor and that end plate. Right, so we're going to go ahead and remove this stepper motor. So it's 4 M5 55 millimeter screws. And it's going to be one 40 millimeter spacer and one 6 millimeter spacer, just like we did on the X. All right, so it's one M5 55 millimeter screw, one 6 millimeter spacer, and one 40 millimeter spacer. So I'm going to remove the other 3 so I can take the motor off. All right, and we're going to go ahead and, now that the stepper motor's off, we're going to remove the flexible coupler. There we go. Now we're going to repeat this process for the other side of the machine. The only difference on the other side is we also need to remove a nut and bolt that's holding the drag chain on. So I'm going to go ahead and get these other sides done, then we'll move on to the next step. Now that we have all of the end plates taken off, we can remove this beam, and we can remove the Y carriage from the Y beam. And we're going to do the same thing on the other side. And for now, I'm going to leave my spoil board supports, and these other beams right where they are. When you buy the Queenbee Ultra, the full kit, they come with a new recommended way for the spoil board to be set up. But I'm quite happy with the way mine is set up right now. So if possible, I'm going to leave it all intact. And that way, it's less for me to take apart, and it'll be easier to square up when I put the upgrade kit on. Alright guys, I remembered one thing we do need to take off of the X carriage and the Y carriages is we're going to need some of these nut blocks for the new build. So these are fairly easy to take apart. You got your screws, some spacers, some shims, your nut block, and the nuts. So I'm going to go ahead and pull those off of the rest of these. To remove the Z-axis nut block properly, we have to separate the Z plate from the X carriage plate. To do that, you have to remove 8 M5 20 millimeter bolts and the nylon nuts that go on them. So you have to hold the Allen key on the inside while you use a wrench on the outside. It's a little bit tricky to hold it in place while you're undoing them. There you go. Once you remove all those bolts, then that gives you access to the bolts that hold the nut block in. So that way you can hold them with an Allen key while you undo it with your wrench. So you have to remove the two 25mm bolts with M5 lock nuts. And also there will be a precision shim and a 3mm spacer.
And this one has an extra lock nut on it.
So there you go. There is your Z-axis nut block. So now we're going to go back to removing these ones, which are much easier. So I'll get all those done, and then we'll move on to the next part. And these ones also have a M5 20mm bolt, an M5 lock nut, a 3mm spacer, and a shim. And just a reminder, make sure you label all your parts as you take them off, in case we have to reuse some of these for the upgrade build. So I'm going to go ahead and get these all done, then we'll move on. Alright guys, that concludes my disassembly video. Everything that needed to be disassembled has been, and I neatly labeled all the parts and nuts and bolts in case we need any of them when we build the upgrade kit. So stay tuned for my next video, and we'll be assembling the CNC Queenbee Ultra kit from Yuyong Industries. And when you get a chance, please like, comment, and subscribe so then you can get notified when my next video comes out. Thanks guys, I'll see you soon.